Hello, and welcome once again to Neurologic. I'm your host, Leo Jones. It was just over a week ago that I discussed a variety of punitive and restrictive measures that are being implemented across the United States, claimed in the name of safety and security for autistics, yet the reality of such efforts proved to be to the contrary. While I don't expect such methods to go away overnight, I naively thought that once people started to seriously consider drones as an acceptable way to track autistics, that would curtail, or at least pump the brakes, on these invasive and dehumanizing procedures. However, as our fellow autistics across the pond can attest, this is absolutely not the case. Less than 2 weeks has gone by, and someone autistic noticed that the DVLA, that's the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency for those not familiar, had made a noteworthy change on their website concerning drivers with disabilities. I'll let an article from The Guardian explain. Quote, "Until recently, the website has simply said that drivers must tell the DVLA if they have an autistic spectrum disorder and it affects their driving. This is standard for many conditions. The final clause has been removed and is now in a separate paragraph warning of the risk of a £1,000 fine or possible prosecution if these drivers are involved in an accident. The surprise change in policy, which was not communicated to any autistic people, charities, or medical professionals, emerged after a person with autism contacted the National Autistic Society and told them the DVLA website said drivers must disclose if they have an autistic spectrum disorder. Jane Harris, the Director of External Affairs and Social Change at the NAS, said, quote, "We are very concerned by the suggestion that people should inform the DVLA after being diagnosed as autistic. Autism is a lifelong disability, and if someone has passed their driving test, we can't see how an autism diagnosis would change their ability to drive. We have contacted DVLA, who have told us that the gov.uk online guidance was wrong previously, and that autistic people should notify them of their diagnosis," she said. "We are questioning the justification for this directly with them, as many of our supporters are very concerned as they were not previously aware that they needed to do this. We don't believe that the DVLA guidance reflects the autism spectrum properly and are calling for the DVLA to make sure that no one is fined until this matter has been resolved." End quote. The DVLA said, quote, "There have been no changes to autism spectrum disorder being a notifiable condition. This has been the case for a number of years. We have recently aligned the advice on our A to Z guide for the public with the advice for medical professionals. Notifying DVLA of a medical condition doesn't mean a driver will automatically lose their license. In fact, more often than not, they can continue to drive. We always keep our advice under review and work with our independent medical panels to do so." End quote. Despite that reassurance, the change in policy has caused a great deal of anxiety in the autistic community. Laura James, ambassador for the NAS, said, quote, "We're upset on a number of levels, but the lack of communication is horrifying, as we've all potentially been driving illegally since they changed the rules. Also, we were all autistic when we passed our tests, which are obviously designed to test people's skills and ensure they are safe to drive. So this change seems nonsensical." End quote. Informing the DVLA is not a simple process. The form asks questions that relate to substance abuse and psychiatric treatment, but nothing about autism itself. Drivers have to give information on their GP, general practitioner, and specialist, and, said James, quote, as most GPs have a very vague understanding of autism and most autistic adults don't have a specialist, it is hugely worrying, as many of us could lose our driving licenses for essentially being different. End quote. That was all from The Guardian, and that's some very, very serious stuff going on. I'll be very honest here. This is just astonishing, but not surprising. For those who may not be aware, there seems to be a lot of conflict over autism in the UK right now, a large portion of which is centered around vaccines. And we're all pretty familiar with the whole vaccine thing going on, so most of you will understand what I mean. As a community, I'm sure we probably thought this would be coming, but perhaps not this early and not so sneakily. I mean, they just threw it on the website and nobody's really sure when this change was done. I would encourage many of you to go to the Internet Wayback Machine, maybe check out previous versions of the site. Maybe we can find out when this is put in place and tie it to something else. But the DVLA making this change has brought up a lot of questions. If I've passed my tests, paid my fees, earned my license, and have a spotless driving record, how will this change affect my driving? Will I be a restricted driver? Am I allowed to have passengers? Are my insurance rates going to go up because of my diagnosis? And more importantly, who the fuck made this decision and isn't taking ownership of it? Seriously, no one is sure who or whom is behind it, aside from the DVLA and their vague independent medical panels, whatever those are, whoever's on them. There is no cited study, no legislative policy, no monumental disaster or statistics or any kind of proof that autistics are somehow less safe behind a wheel than the average driver. Yet this change was unilaterally made without consult, without declaration, and without notification. In other words, sketchy as fuck. But let's take a look at the research. Perhaps there's something to this, right? Well, to steal a phrase from the show Adam Ruins Everything, well, actually, no. Anne Memmott, autistic consultant, professional, and national and international speaker based in the UK, and Anne, if you're listening, I'm sorry if I butchered your last name, I deeply apologize. Anne decided to look at the research and put together an excellent article detailing what they found. So, from Anne's article, and I'm going to quote here. Let us remember that most autistic people wishing to drive make a choice to have driving lessons, where a highly qualified driving instructor already assesses our competence. We also have to pass the same tests as everyone else on eyesight, on knowledge, and on practical skills behind the wheel. These tests are administered by highly qualified examiners who test every aspect of competence. 100% of autistic licensed drivers were autistic when they took and passed their test. It's lifelong neurodiversity, not a sudden health condition, not a mental illness. That's a fact. Apparently, someone has told the DVLA that autistic people may be more likely to have driving problems than others. Aside from the illogic of assuming that this would only be apparent after we've passed a test showing we're competent, let's have a romp through the research on this subject. So Anne continues and details various papers, so we're going to go through those. Almberg et al., 2015. Forgot to assess whether their autistic people also had ADHD. Bishop et al., 2017. Autistic participants, quote, showed no difference in reaction time between hazard types, end quotes. And that's, of course, compared to non-autistic individuals. Small sample, but hardly a sign of a problem. Brooks et al., 2016. Minimal performance differences were observed between autistic and non-autistic participants. Nothing of danger here then. Cox et al., 2017. Only bother looking at novice drivers in a computer simulation of driving, which isn't evidence of anything in particular. Small sample. Factor, 2016. Looked at young adults in a computer driving simulator again, which, as for Cox above, isn't evidence of on-road driving ability. The autistic people had less driving experience than the non-autistic participants also. Raymer et al., 2013. Looked at 10 young male autistic people and used a computer simulator, so not real driving. Again. Shepard et al., 2016. Looked at a small group of young male autistic adults and noticed that slower reaction speed was related to IQ, not autism. None actually had a driving license. Wade et al., 2015. Looked at 6 autistic teenagers. 6 autistic teenagers. That's an incredibly small sample size. Well, older drivers? No. Experienced drivers? No. Women drivers? No. Most autistic people are adults. Most are over age 30. Around half are not male. Many are from minority ethnic groups or the professions. Some are serving police, fire crew, ambulance, and paramedic staff. Doctors, nurses, professionals of every kind. Where is the evidence of incompetent driving for these latter groups? There is none. Our young people deserve a future where their competence is taken as seriously as it is for everyone else. If they pass a test, they have been assessed as competent. If that test does not test for competence, improve the test. Do not punish those taking it. Why precisely it should be assumed that they are still incompetent after achieving a license is not yet clear to me. Again, that's an excellent article from Memmott about the various research that's out there concerning autistics and driving, and how not only is it error-filled and error-prone, but there is nothing showing that autistics are somehow less competent than other drivers. I especially enjoy that last sentence. That was perfect. Is that how are we assessed as being incompetent after achieving a passing test, a passing result? It doesn't make any sense. If you pass your test and you receive your license, how are you judged as incompetent later on without having to be put through the same test? The DVLA was merely adding this to their site, not actually putting any kind of new regulations in place. So you weren't told to go take a test again to prove your competency. You were merely told you must inform the DVLA of your diagnosis. So it doesn't make any sense. It's very confusing if we're going by competence. So even when looking at the research, there is no definitive evidence that licensed, passed, approved, and insured drivers are any less competent than anyone else on the road, as I've just said. So why the change by the DVLA? Did someone autistic hit an agency member's car or ding the door or something? Why the change? Hopefully we find out in the coming weeks. The good news is that as of today, as I'm recording this on March 4th, the web page in question for the DVLA has been reverted. Reporting your autistic status is only required if it affects your driving, which is exactly the way it was before the change. And that, to me, makes sense. If being autistic affects your driving, because autism is a spectrum, and so some people may not be able to drive, may not be able to handle the overwhelming sensory input that is driving, then yes, you need to probably disclose that to the DVLA, or in our case, the Department of Motor Vehicles, or the Department of Transportation here in the U.S. But again, this is up to you. If you don't want to drive, that's okay. But the original wording seemed to suffice. And so I'm continually just confused as to why they made the change, and I can't quite figure it out. I hope those across the pond can at least shed some light here, because this is very confusing, at least for me. Here in the U.S., our driving laws and governmental agencies work a bit differently. In fact, the licensing and even insurance can actually vary from one state to the next. So you could be in New York and you travel to New Jersey and the laws have changed. While the federal government has a certain set of standards that oversees the states themselves get more leeway in deciding the more granular policies. Depending on where you live, driving may literally be the only way to get to work, school, or anywhere else. Where I am from, you cannot go without a car. It's just, you can't. You really can't. Our mass transit systems are woefully underfunded and at least 10 to 20 years behind other regions. To not be able to drive severely impedes fulfilling an independent life. And I know this from personal experience. I shudder to think of what could happen if legislators in our country got wind of this change by the DVLA and decided to discreetly pass a bill, or a couple of others, that enacted restrictions similar to the DVLA's, or worse. Think of it. One state legislature passes a law requiring all state licensed drivers disclose their autistic status, and that status is indicated on their license, which is something that we do in regards to vision impairments for obvious reasons, but we could easily do for autistics. Suddenly, autism registries are a thing for those who drive while autistic and are copied by other states. Insurance companies using their own doctors to determine if you're medically competent enough to drive, instead of your own, who initially gave you your diagnosis, to try and deny your claim because their doctor says autistics cannot drive. Though I'm sure there will be some sort of more expensive car insurance for autistics, because, they still would like to have drivers, and we cannot have people stop from driving as much, but we can at least charge more for insurance and refer to it in that classic discriminatory, condescending way, calling it special healthcare needs insurance or special driver's insurance or something along that line. Perhaps autism warrior moms can get a discount. In the meantime, if you are autistic and can obtain a driver's license, I enthusiastically encourage you to do so. Don't let those in power intimidate you with discriminatory moves like this. The more of us that have a driver's license, the more leverage we will have against policies that come up, just like this one. As we have said before, nothing about us without us. I'm Leo Jones, and this has been Neurologic. Neurologic is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. To view a copy of this license, visit creativecommons.org/licenses/by-nc-nd/4.0 or send the letter to Creative Commons, P.O. Box 1866, Mountain View, California 94042, USA. Neurologic uses the song Furious Freak, created by Kevin MacLeod, for its intro and outro music. Visit him at incompetech.com. Furious Freak is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license, creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. You can reach Leo Jones and Neurologic by email at neurologicpodcast@gmail.com.